Okay, I think we're live. So hello everyone, and welcome to Quinn's second online webinar, and thank you all for joining. I'm Barry Rogers, the VP of Product at Quinn, and hopefully some of you have been using our diabetes self-management app and know a little about Quinn's mission to give power and choice to people living with diabetes. This is the second in a series of discussions we'll be hosting on important subjects for people living with diabetes, from food and nutrition through diabetes decision-making to mental health and how to improve well-being and choice. We hope you find them informative and interesting, supportive and motivational, and most of all novel, as we don't plan to shy away from difficult topics. We received some great feedback from our first webinar on understanding food myths in type 1 diabetes. If you haven't watched that webinar yet, it is available on our YouTube channel, but don't go to YouTube yet, watch this one first. Today our topic is handling the uncertainty of managing diabetes. We're going to dive into discussions around living with uncertainty, managing risk, and dealing with unpredictable outcomes. And with us this evening, we have a wonderful, knowledgeable and experienced guest joining us from the west coast of the US to share his thoughts with us. So Dr. Mark Heyman is a diabetes psychologist and a certified diabetes care and education specialist. He is the CEO of the Center for Diabetes and Mental Health in San Diego. He is passionate about providing diabetes education and evidence-based mental health treatment and online programs to people with diabetes. He is the host of the Diabetes Psychologist podcast, and he's also been living with type 1 diabetes since 1999. So welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Barry. Great to be here.
Cool, thank you. And so this webinar is an interactive webinar, so we're excited to have everyone join in the fun who's watching. Hopefully you should all be able to see that we have an area for chat, questions and polls, and I can see some of you have found the emojis as well already. So for this session, if you have any questions you would like Mark to answer, please submit them and upvote any questions you would most like answered. We will have 10 minutes or so at the end for a Q&A. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can. We'll also be holding some polls to get your opinions on a few subjects. As a special bonus, for those of you who participate in the polls and are still watching at the end of the webinar, we will be having a prize draw. One lucky person will receive a £20 Amazon voucher. And finally, a chat is available for you to share your thoughts, react, and engage with us and each other. So let's see some hellos in the chat to get it going. Managing diabetes is obviously a very personal subject, and remember, it's okay for people to have different opinions. So let's try to keep the chat positive and supportive and avoid trolling so everyone can have a good time today. So now that's out of the way, Mark, are you ready to go?
I sure am. Let's go.
Let's hit it going. So let's dive straight in with a big question to start. So Mark, what advice do you have for making diabetes decisions when dealing with so many unknowns that will impact the blood sugar outcome of those decisions?
That's a great question, Barry. And diabetes is challenging because you feel like you have all these things coming at you all at one time, and trying to make decisions is hard. And I think the best advice I can give you give anybody is to just take a breath and step back. Because if we start making decisions about diabetes management under stress, we're going to be very reactive, and we want to be able to respond as opposed to react. And the best way of doing that is to give ourselves some space and some time. 10 seconds, even a minute or 5 minutes with diabetes likely is not going to be an issue. And so if you're feeling stressed, be able to take a breath and just say, I'm going to make an intentional decision here, in a way that allows you the time and the space that you need. Because I think that when we're feeling stressed, our first reaction is to just react and try to get rid of that stress. And when we do that, we usually get ourselves in trouble. And so by giving ourselves a breath and a little space, that allows us to make an intentional decision that's going to be helpful and not going to be influenced by the stress as much as it might be if we didn't give ourselves that space.
That's a great answer. I really appreciate the distinction between responding and reacting. I like that distinction there. It's really cool.
Yeah.
So do you have any techniques to support the mental process when experiencing unwanted or unexpected blood sugars that can lead to counterproductive actions, such as rage bolusing or over-treating lows?
Yeah, I think that breathing is a really great one. And the great thing about breathing is that you always have your breath with you. You're never without it. But to be able to just give yourself a beat and just to take a breath and say, I know what I want to do. I know what my mind, my body is telling me that I need to do, in terms of a reaction. But use your brain and be able to have that space where you can just say, what's going to lead to the best outcome here? Because a difference, what happens for us is that we get, really fused between our thoughts and our behaviors. And our goal here is really to have a little separation, or maybe even a lot of separation. So you have a thought of, I really want to rage bolus, and then you have some separation between that, and then you can make a decision whether to do it or not to do it. And that decision is going to be your decision, as opposed to the decision of your frustration or your anger or whatever else is going on for you. And my goal for everybody with diabetes is to be able to make a decision for themselves. I don't care what your decision is. I mean, I certainly want to be the healthiest thing, but I want you making the decision, as opposed to having your emotions or your thoughts making that decision. And so taking a breath, giving yourself some space, noticing what you're experiencing and naming it can go a really long way to helping you get that space, and then to be able to make decisions when stress is present for you.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And just to follow on, I guess, from that a little bit, I guess when people are feeling low as well, sometimes it isn't always as easy to keep in mind what's going on. Is there any advice as well for kind of not going towards that over treating of lows in that moment where your head might not be the clearest?
Oh man, that's one of the hardest things. And trust me, I know I've been there many times recently where you really just want to overtreat. And I think that the best piece of advice is twofold. One is, give yourself, think ahead and plan ahead, and give yourself some guidelines as to, and some boundaries around how you're treating your lows. So, I mean, using 15 grams of carbs in 15 minutes is a great one, but just saying, whenever I'm low, I'm going to follow these rules for myself. And then after 15 minutes, if I'm still feeling low, or if I'm still low, then I'm going to treat again. But if you go into treating lows without kind of a rule or rubric to use, it's really easy to go off track and to overtreat, especially because that feeling is just so awful. The other thing is when that does happen, and it happens for me, it's going to happen for people with diabetes, that just happens, is to be compassionate with yourself, and to not beat yourself up for that. When you're low, your body is telling you, like, if you don't give me sugar, I'm going to die. And while that is in some ways it's true, it's not true in the sense, like, if I don't binge eat, I'm going to die. But your body is telling you these things, and it's really hard to separate yourself from them. And so while we want to be able to be mindful and moderate, and that's helpful, when you do overtreat, and it's going to happen again for me, I'm sure, and for everybody else, that forgive yourself and just say, I'm going to try to learn my lesson and move. In progress is slow, and perfection's not the goal.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I guess you're merging as well there, sort of the proactive nature of having the rules of, this is what I'm going to do, and then marrying it to the responding rather than reacting. It makes total sense.
And it's a good lesson for everything in life. We can't, if we expect perfection, we're going to fail. But we can certainly expect progress and hope for progress.
Great point. Great point. Okay, let's move on to our first poll of the day. So I'm going to publish the poll, and so hopefully everyone who's watching will just see the poll pop up. So this is a question that's completely anonymous. So please do try and be as honest as possible, because we're trying to find out how people in the diabetes community are feeling about certain topics. And so the poll question we've got in front of us is, how often do you feel frustrated or emotional because your blood sugars don't do what you expect? And as Mark was talking about there's definitely an emotional reaction to a lot of what goes on with diabetes. So it'll be interesting to see what you all think on that matter. We will go through each of the polls at the end. So do please keep watching to see how everybody else is also feeling in the community. Whilst everyone's looking at the polls, we'll jump on to our next question. And so, Mark, even though you have so much experience of helping others, when you have challenging days because of diabetes, are there still times where you find frustration and emotion leads to that self-judgment, which you've said kind of already that you don't really want to be going down towards? And if so, how do you use your own guidance to help you recover from your own instincts?
That happens all the time, Barry. It happens all the time. I'll tell you a quick story. So last week, I was my wife was out of town, and so I was on my own for dinner. And long story short, but I didn't have dinner until very, very late. And I was low when I had dinner, and so I ate my dinner. I was low, and I didn't bolus for my dinner because I was low, and I one forgot, but two, I didn't really want to bolus when I was so low. Well, long story short, I woke up in the middle of the night and my blood sugar was sky high. And I was mad at myself. I was mad at myself for not bolusing. I was mad at myself for over treating my low. And I was mad at myself because I'm a professional in this field. And I quote unquote should be able to do a better job at this. And that was tough. I did, because I didn't feel good. So yeah, I had the emotional response compounded with the just the physical response, which was pretty awful. But I was able to recognize the story that I was telling myself. And what you see is that we tell ourselves all kinds of stories about diabetes and what it means about us, what it means about other people, what it means about the world. And the story I was telling myself is, I can't believe this happened. I'm a horrible diabetes professional. And if I would have allowed that story to go on, I would have a hard time sitting here in front of you with a straight face, kind of giving this advice. But I was able to recognize that story and say, okay, well, this story isn't necessarily true, and I'm going to pull myself back from it and not allow my mind to go down that way. That story is going to be there in the background, but I'm not going to engage with it. And so, that was really helpful for me. The other thing that I recognized when this happened was, so overnight I felt pretty bad. My blood sugar came down around lunchtime the next day. So it was a long while, and I kind of forgot about it. I didn't really think much about it after that. And I recognized that because I was talking to someone about diabetes later that day, and I recognized that between about noon and about 5 p.m. or so, I hadn't thought about that incident at all. And for me, that was a really enlightening thing, or really important, because when you're in the midst of it, I recognize you feel like, oh my gosh, this is never going to end, and this feeling is going to be here forever. But I was able to see, wow, it happened for a short period of time, but then after that, the feeling went away. And so if we keep that in perspective, if we say, okay, right now I'm not feeling well, and that's the reality of what I'm feeling right now, but this isn't going to last forever, it makes that a lot easier to deal with. And so I try to kind of remind myself when I'm having those tough days that, yeah, this is tough right now and it's not very comfortable, but I also know that it's not going to last for very long, and that my feelings come in ebb and flows, and that I know that I can handle tough stuff, especially if it's time limited. And that's the thing to remember, is that the tough stuff with diabetes, it may happen a lot, but it's also time limited. It doesn't last forever.
Yeah, it makes so much sense again. And I like the fact as well that you're accepting of your emotions in the moment, but then try not to let them affect you going forward. And again, wow, you can't change your past blood sugars.
Yeah, I think we've all learned that from past experience. I tried. What other option do you have but to accept it? Because when you don't accept the feelings, which is easy to try to do, you end up just hitting your head against a wall and not achieving anything. And so, which makes it even more challenging. So, and I'm certainly not perfect at this all the time myself, but I've learned that by accepting it and kind of putting my guard down and not fighting with those feelings, it lets them pass a lot sooner and a lot smoother.
Makes so much sense. It's really interesting to hear as well from someone who's both living with the condition but also has so much experience. It's really, really fascinating. And so the next question is, we hear so often how unpleasant low blood sugar can be, and understandably the uncertainty of not knowing when this might happen can lead to people developing a fear of hypoglycemia. Yeah. So how do you support people who keep their blood sugar high or avoid certain activities in order to reduce the risk of hypos?
Yeah, that's a great question. Then fear of hypos is something that happens more often than most people think, and we don't talk enough about it. And there's a couple things that I do. So I think the important thing to recognize with fear of hypos is that hypos, we want you to be scared of low blood sugar. Not to the point where you're changing your behavior, but if you were not nervous about low blood sugar, you may get yourself in some trouble. And so having that anxiety is actually a super helpful thing. And reminding people that anxiety around low blood sugar, to a certain degree, is important to keeping us safe, just like having anxiety about walking to a street without looking both ways is an important thing, especially when you're in the UK. When I'm in the UK, I look the wrong way. but you want to have anxiety about that, but you don't want to have anxiety to the point where it paralyzes you and you can't move forward. And what I know is that what scares people most about low blood sugar is not necessarily the feeling of it. That is scary and it's not comfortable, but it's a fear that they're not going to be able to handle things when it does happen. And so they're not going to have the ability to get up out of their chair and go to the refrigerator and get a glass of juice. So they're not going to be able to think straight. And my goal is to help people to see that that's possible, that they can't, that when low blood sugars happen, and they will, that they have the ability to take care of themselves and to deal with them. And if you're certain that you have the ability to deal with those tough things, especially low blood sugars, you're going to be a whole lot less scared of them. And so if someone comes to my office to see me and they have this fear, what I like to do is I actually like to help them to go low or go lower than they're comfortable with, to see what that's like. So just to see, yeah, it may not be comfortable. Yes, I may be scared, but I can handle it. I can deal with whatever comes along if that's the case. So really kind of giving people the confidence that they need to be able to handle those lows and handle activities around lows, because what happens is, people start avoiding activities. They don't drive, or they don't ride their bike, or they don't exercise. And because they're worried about what will happen if they do go low. And we want to show people that, that the chances of that happening are probably less than I think it is. But also, if it does happen, that while it's not going to be comfortable or fun, that they have the ability to handle it.
Yeah, I really find that interesting as well, that sort of allowing someone to experience something in that supportive environment, so they've got that experience to take forward with them. It makes a total sense. But again, I can imagine people in that scenario, as you're trying to explain that to them for the first time, there's also a little bit of discomfort there, even if you do have the support of yourself and your team as well.
Right. I mean, the same thing is true. This isn't so true now that many people are on insulin pumps. But even, you think about when I was first diagnosed with diabetes, and the doctor handed me a syringe and said, "Give yourself this injection." I remember thinking to myself, I can't do this. I can't handle giving myself an injection every single day. And then I did it, and I realized that, it actually doesn't hurt at all. So I realized, oh, that's not that bad, or I can handle having to do this. And it's really a matter of gaining experience. You can think about all the things that when you have no experience doing something, it scares you because you don't know what's going to come, and you don't know that you can handle it. But then once you gain some experience, then it becomes easier. And I don't want people getting experience going low too often or on purpose. But if you have diabetes and you're managing it decently well, you're going to go low. So it's a good time to learn and make sure you're safe in that process, but to gain that experience that you can handle these things.
Cool, wonderful. And as you touched on technology there, that takes us on very nicely to our second poll question. So I'm going to publish that now. And so the question poll that we're showing is around how people feel around technology, and what sort of impact that has had on your life. We all know that technology can be wonderful, but it also opens up a lot of potential mental health issues as well, with constant access to, say, CGM data, for example, which wasn't available before. So now there is constantly information flowing towards you. So again, it'd be great to see how those watching are viewing the technology that they have got in front of them. And as we've got that, that's also our next question. So technology has amplified the amount of information people with diabetes have available to self-manage and remove some uncertainty. But with CGMs in particular, the constant access to blood sugar data can actually add mental load and increase time thinking about diabetes. So do you have any advice for people who are trying to find the balance between living their lives whilst reducing the uncertainty of blood sugar outcomes?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that there's no one size fits all answer here, because for some people, they're able to monitor their blood sugar on a regular basis, have it on their computer or on their phone or on their watch, and just have it be part of their regular day. For some people, it becomes an obsession. They're looking at it all the time. They want that information, and without it, it scares them. So I think that one thing that I've been thinking about a lot about recently, in which really fits into this conversation, is boundaries in diabetes and setting boundaries for yourself, and with other people around diabetes. But this is really for yourself, and be able to say, I need some time away from this. And that I can handle not knowing my blood sugars all the time. And that takes some practice and takes some ability to be a little bit anxious, but setting boundaries and saying, I don't need to know my blood sugar every second of the day. Or maybe I can set specific times when I'm looking at it, which are important, or I have some guidelines that I follow that I set for myself. I always look at it when I wake up and before I eat and before I exercise. But other times I leave it alone. And if that's your personality, if you know that that's going to be helpful, then I would encourage you to set those boundaries. We think about what happened, or how we dealt with diabetes before CGM. And it was a very different story. And this is a fairly new issue because CGM is a very new technology. But, we all manage our diabetes, checking our blood sugar, 5, 6, maybe 8 times a day. And while that wasn't ideal for our blood sugar management, for our anxiety, it probably was much better. So again, whatever's going to work for you, but being able to set boundaries for yourself and to stick to them, because boundaries around these things are important. And know that doing this is a safe thing. Certainly, if you're hypo and aware, that having a knowledge of your CGM data is important, but use a CGM that has an alarm on it that will alert you if there's an issue. But when the alarm's not going off, there's no reason to be checking all the time, especially if that's going to make you more on guard and more vigilant about and more focused really on your diabetes. Because as we talked about before the webinar started, Barry, my goal, and I know the goal of Quinn, is to have people think about their diabetes less. And thinking about your diabetes more is not going to help you think about it less. Taking a little bit more of not a hands-off approach, but a less aggressive approach can oftentimes be really helpful, even if that means, and there's a balance here between good diabetes management and quality of life. And I think that's an important balance that we have to really consider, that the doctors don't want to talk about, but I'm happy to talk about it. And I think that we could all have A1Cs of 5% if we ate the same thing every day and never left our house. But I don't want to eat the same thing every day, and I don't want to never leave my house. So I'm willing to have an A1C a little bit higher than 5% or a lot higher than 5%, because my quality of life needs to balance with my diabetes management. And lots of places they overlap, but there are some places where you got to make decisions that are intentional. And if you want to have the cake, or you want to take some time off from your CGM, then that's an intentional decision that you can make in the service of your quality of life.
Yeah, it's so good to hear from someone who works in a diabetes profession as well, because it's starting to become a bit more of a prevailing opinion that this sort of the mental quality of life aspects have been kind of left behind up until recently. But was one of the things that technology has started to open up is with access to newer insulins, newer technologies, things like pumps, we can now maybe really start to push on with, well, how can we find that balance for people living with diabetes?
Yeah, and we have to make sure that people are safe and healthy, but we also have to make sure that people are enjoying their lives and doing the things that they want to do, because who cares if you're safe and healthy if you can't do what you want to do? I mean, it doesn't really make much sense.
Exactly. Awesome. So we're starting to get some great questions coming in. So yeah, we've got, I think, one final question for Mark before we go to a final poll. And then we'll get onto the Q&A. So if you do have any more questions watching, please do put them into our questions area, and we'll go through them shortly. But first, Mark, the fear of long-term complications is frequently used as a motivator by healthcare professionals and medical devices. So how do you support people who are worried about longer-term health uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I will tell you right now that fear of long-term complications is not a good motivator. It's a good motivator in theory, but in reality, it's not a good one. Simply because while long-term complications are very real and they're very scary, they're not immediate. And I like to use the example, you have two choices. If someone were to give you two choices, do you want to have a big piece of cake right now, or tonight, or do you want to have, or the possibility of developing a long-term complication in 20 years? Not a certainty, but a possibility. Almost all of us are going to choose the cake right now because we want that immediate satisfaction as opposed to this vague thing in the future. So, so using complications as a motivator is not a good way of doing things. We really want to find, what's motivating you now to live a full and healthy life, and how is changing behavior now going to help that? In terms of thinking about, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. In terms of thinking about, sorry, can you ask the question again?
Yeah, sure. So we're talking about the fear of long-term health uncertainty. Yeah.
Yes, gotcha. In terms of the fear of long-term complications, I think it's important to look at the data and to look at the statistics. And what we know from the research is that people, while complications are real, people they overestimate the risk of complications tenfold. So, you ask someone with diabetes, no matter how their management is and what their A1C is, what is your risk of developing retinopathy in the next 10 years? They will tell you that their answer will no doubt be much higher than the actual risk. And so we want to be realistic about the risk and recognize that the risk is very real. But at the same time, the best way to reduce the risk is to manage your diabetes well now. But that also has benefits now. You're going to feel better. You're going to have more energy, all kinds of things that are going to benefit you now. And then also that reduces the risk, but also reduces your anxiety about the long-term complications. Also, it's important to recognize that we don't have, so we know that a higher A1C increases your risk of complications, but it's not a linear relationship. And so just because your A1C is 9% and mine is 6.5%, your risk is more, but I may develop complications and you may not. And so just because things aren't going well, right now does not mean that you are doomed and that you're destined to have a complication. It's a little bit more random than that, unfortunately. But to have some just information and data, and know that even if things, just like you said before, you can't change what happened in the past. I can't change my blood sugars from last night or what I ate last night. But what I can change is what I'm doing moving forward. And so thinking about the past and ruminating about the past is not helpful because you cannot behave in the past. You can only behave right now. And so let's focus on what we can do right now to reduce your risk of complications, as well as to live the best life you can right now. And if we can do that, we can get some balance here that we really need.
Yeah, again, it makes total sense. And I've read like some of these studies myself as part of our research for Quinn. But some of the information obviously isn't in the nicest and most easily understandable format. So maybe there is a job here for translating that science and that research into something a bit more digestible for the wider community.
I agree. Finding ways to be realistic. I mean, we don't want to sugarcoat it. We don't want to say, oh yeah, you can do whatever you want and complications aren't going to happen. That's not realistic as well. But we want to be honest with ourselves and with each other on both sides of the coin. And I think this is true for mental health in general with diabetes. We want to be, recognize that and be honest in saying diabetes is hard and diabetes is challenging. There's lots of things that come along with that. But on the other side, we want to be honest and say we can handle it. And we can deal with it. And that, there's a point where it goes from being the reality of it being hard to kind of the stories we tell ourselves that make it even harder.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Awesome. So that kind of brings us on to our final poll as well, where even though we've heard from Mark, we also want to find out about how you view the fear of long-term health complications and whether that is a motivator for yourself or not. Again, different people have different opinions on these subjects, and it'd be interesting to see of those watching where we each lie. But it also takes us nicely on to the Q&As. So we've got quite a few questions and quite a few upvotes. If you still want to add any questions, please do whilst we're going along. But we'll start with this top one from Samantha. So I've noticed that if I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, if I check my fasting sugar and it's good, I get into a habit of then not eating as I don't want it to go high. So how can I manage the anxiety of my sugars increasing after meals?
Well, guess what? Your sugars are going to increase after meals, just like growth will, just like berries will too. And Barry doesn't have diabetes, so sugars increasing after meals are a normal thing. And so I think recognizing that it's to be expected, and not to worry about it or beat yourself up about that, and it's just being realistic about what's going to happen, but also knowing that what goes up, as long as you take insulin for it, will come down, and be realistic about that. Also, notice your feelings, and notice your hesitation about it, and see if kind of giving that separation can help you at all. And also, and finally, there may be some times when your blood sugar is high, and the best choice for you is not to eat, and that's okay too. We need to make intentional choices for ourselves about what's best for us, and I don't mean reactive choices, but really proactive choices, and saying, this food is not going to be the best for me right now because of my blood sugar, and to let go of that and say, that's okay. Or this food may not be the best, but I'm choosing to eat it, and I'm going to deal with the consequences. But being realistic about what's going to happen, and not being surprised when things happen, either on the positive or negative side, when these challenges do exist.
Cool. Wonderful. I saw lots of emojis popping up there, so hopefully people are enjoying that answer and finding it useful. Next up, we've got a question from Sophie. So some top tips for accepting perfectionism isn't possible when living with diabetes.
Perfectionism is not possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Take a deep breath. Perfectionism isn't possible with anything. And so I don't think the diabetes is unique here. But recognizing what your goals are and what's realistic for you, and reminding yourself that progress is what's important and not perfection. And progress does not always go in a straight line. That when you're climbing a mountain or hiking a mountain, there are some times when you're on your way up and you're going down, and that's normal, and that's a natural part of the process. And so also, I think we need to be realistic about, especially with CGM technology, about what we're looking for. What is ideal here? I talk to a lot of people who say, I want my time in range to be 95%. And I look at them and I'm like, I don't think I've ever met anybody who has a time in range of 95%. And they say, well, that's an A. I mean, I don't know how, I hope this is translating into terms that are familiar with your audience, but that's an A. And I say, well, your goal should be 70%, or so. And they say that's almost a failing grade. I don't want it 70%. I want it to be 95%. And that's not, they don't translate well. And so, we say a good time in range is about 70%. And if you can do that, then you're doing an amazing job, and kind of resetting your expectations around what perfectionism, what success looks like. Because if success is 100%, never having your blood sugar out of range, you're going to fail. But if success is realistic for you and you can get there, you're going to feel much more empowered. And empowerment is really the goal, not perfection.
That's a wonderful answer again. And again, another emoji explosion. So we've got a couple of questions here about diabetes burnout. So is diabetes burnout recognized by medical professionals? And if so, what should they be offering as help?
Yeah, so it's a good question and a complicated one. So the short answer is no, it's not. And the reason being is because diabetes burnout is not a diagnosis that, because diagnoses are classified by diagnosis, the American Psychiatric Association, or the medical associations, and those are really for things like billing for medical care. And so diabetes burnout is not one of those things, and not because it doesn't exist, just because it's not an official diagnosis. That being said, I would say that most endocrinologists, worth their salt, do recognize diabetes burnout as a factor, and certainly should be paying attention to it. I want to say, though, that I think there's a lot of misconceptions about diabetes burnout and what diabetes burnout means about somebody who's experiencing it. And I want to say that from my perspective, and I really firmly believe this, is that diabetes burnout is not fun and not something that I wish that anybody has to experience. However, it is a normal reaction to the stress of diabetes. And so if you're not experiencing burnout at some point, I would be pretty shocked, because Diabetes is a nonstop, commitment, or not even a commitment, something that you have to deal with. And so, if you're doing it well, I would expect that at some point you're going to feel burnt out. But also remember that burnout doesn't last very long, or doesn't last. It ebbs and flows. And if you could pay attention to those ebbs and flows, it can be really helpful in saying, okay, today I'm a little less burnt out than I was yesterday, or today I'm more burnt out than I was yesterday. And seeing that change and seeing that change is possible can help you to feel like this can change. One thing I like to let people know, I always, sometimes when I'm seeing a patient and they're telling me about something like this, I will ask them to see their CGM graph, or show them my CGM graph. And you look at these graphs, and sometimes what looks to be a flat line. But if you look at the data even more carefully, you can see that there's slight variations in blood sugar. They're very rarely stable over time. And the same thing is true for burnout. You can say, I'm burnt out, and I've been burnt out for the past month. Okay, well, that's true to some degree, but I would be willing to bet that your burnout has changed at least a little bit over that time. And seeing that change can show you that it will change, and that it will get better. Cool. It may get worse also at some point, but it will also get better.
Yeah, it's another great answer. And so hopefully, Francesca, that also answered your question on how can you minimize the impacts of diabetic burnout. It sounds again like you're saying there's going to be lows, but there's also going to be times where it turns around, and it's living through that, accepting it, and then hoping kind of for the good times to sort of return a bit more.
Yeah, and I think that, and then when you are experiencing that burnout, I think there's some things you can do to help yourself. One is to give yourself some slack, cut yourself some slack, and say, right now I'm having a hard time, so maybe I want to not focus on diabetes today. Maybe I want to not take a day off, but take a little bit of a mental break for a little while. Get support. People on this webinar, obviously, hopefully you have some support in your life from people, friends and family, and others with diabetes. Let them know how you're feeling. Talk it out. Give your feelings a name. That's also really helpful in terms of diabetes, and also managing your expectations and recognizing that this is something that's expected, and that it will change, as opposed to saying, I'm burnt out and I'm going to be burnt out for the rest of my life. That's not a helpful way of thinking.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for another great answer. Let's have a quick look at our polls, just to have a look to see how the community is feeling about things. And so our first question was, how often do you feel frustrated or emotional because your blood sugars don't do what you expect? And we can see that this is very common for a very large number of people. We've got, I think that's 73% of people who are experiencing it every day or most days. And absolutely no one is saying never or once or twice a month. So this is an extremely common feeling that appears to go along with managing diabetes, which I think, given Mark's explanations as well, is totally understandable, and something we really want to try and tackle. Next up is, has diabetes technology made you spend more time thinking about diabetes? Again, quite a lot of people here saying yes, a lot more time. So we've got 52% of our respondents saying actually they are spending a lot more time with it. Another 27% saying a little more time. And thankfully, some people are actually spending a little less time or a lot less time. So it's good to hear that technology is also helping people with sort of thinking about diabetes less, which again is the long-term intention. And finally, we were looking at, is the fear of long-term complications a large motivator for your diabetes self-management? A bit more of a spread here. Again, we've got actually quite a lot of people again saying yes. So 46% have said yes, but it's also affecting their mental health, which again, totally understandable. Another 32% are saying yes, they do find it motivating. And the remainder, there's quite a few no's as well. So finding very little motivates me for self-management is a little sad to hear. And I'm sure there's definitely people to reach out to about that. Mark and his good team are certainly some of those people. And again, I think where possible to reach out to talk to people is a great thing, either to find out more information, to receive support, and hopefully, yeah, I think we'll give some contact details for Mark later, just in case you do want to reach out. Awesome. So next up, we've still got a few more questions to get through. So from Alicia, how often do you think is acceptable for your blood sugar to go low whilst trying to start a new exercise regime?
That's a good question, and I would encourage you to talk to your specialist about that specifically. You know, we want to make sure that you're being safe, and that your insulin, the more important thing is that your insulin dose is accurate for the type of activity you're doing for that day. And so, you know, we don't, you know, certainly, you know, on average, people with well-managed diabetes go low 3 or 4 times a week. If it's happening more than that, then probably need to make some changes to either your activity, but more importantly to your insulin dosing regimen. But again, it's also important to remember with this is that we learned this recently with CGM data, is that, and also with the hybrid closed loop systems that are coming on into the market, is that basal rates and our basal insulin needs change so often. It's not necessarily fixed. And so if you're going low a lot while exercising and starting a new routine, then you need to pay attention to both that, but also to what your basal rate is and what your needs are on this day, and give yourself some slack on that, because it's your body that's kind of, or your metabolism, I should say, that is impacting it, not any kind of behavior that you're doing. But I can't give any insulin dosing recommendations. I'm not a physician, so I would really encourage you to talk to your specialist about that and get some advice. But hopefully not too often. We want you not going low very often. But we also don't want you to keep your blood sugar high as a way to avoid going low. That would be my one takeaway here.
Cool. Thank you for that. We have a question here that's really interesting, but I'm not sure Mark will be able to answer. And so I've tried to access clinical psychological support, but it isn't offered in my area. And so are there clinical psychologists specializing in type 1 diabetes in the UK? I'm pretty certain there are. And Samantha, I think we can probably try and look to find some more information for you later on. And we'll try and work out a way to publish that so it's available for you. But maybe, Mark, going just to the initial thing of trying to access clinical psychological support and it not being offered in a specific area or under specific insurance, what advice do you have for someone maybe in that scenario?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, unfortunately, there are not a lot of psychologists who specialize in diabetes. And I think you have to ask yourself, why are you seeking mental health support? Is it for something that really needs a psychologist or a therapist that understands diabetes, or can somebody with a more general training help you? And I think a lot of times that the answer is yes. But certainly there are some things where you want a psychologist who understands diabetes and who speaks your language. And if that's the case, I really want to encourage people to think about mental health treatment and support on a continuum. And I have a hypothesis that I use, that if you have 100 people with type 1 diabetes, there may be 3 or 4 folks who need to see me or need to see someone like me. And we are more than happy to help folks who need that support in whatever way we can. But the other 95 need something, but it's not necessarily me. Or it's not, actually, I can say it's not me. Maybe it's this webinar. Maybe it's hearing our conversation, connecting with others in the chat. Maybe it's listening to a podcast. The Diabetes Psychologist podcast is a great option, but there are many others out there too. Maybe it's reading a blog on your website or scrolling Instagram. Maybe it's connecting with support from other people in the community. There are lots of ways we can think about mental health support, and some of them include professional services, but I would say that most of them don't. And there are lots of ways that we can get support that don't need to see a psychologist one-on-one.
Cool. Wonderful answer there. So thank you for that. We'll probably take maybe 2 more questions. And so the first one is an interesting one. So how does living with others and managing your own diet affect you?
Living with others and managing my own diet?
Yeah.
Well, I'm very lucky that I have a 2-year-old daughter, so she doesn't really have much say in what we eat. And my wife is very supportive and helps me to eat a fairly low carb diet. That's just how we generally eat. And so I think that we've been able to negotiate it well. But at the same time, it's kind of twofold. I think for me, it's one is, how do I work with my family together to make sure that what we're eating is going to be the best for my health? But also, how do I allow them and how do I allow myself to be able to do the best that I can with my, in the situation. And so if they want to have food that I don't want to eat, I have to be able to have that boundary for myself and allow myself to be able to say no. Or if I want to allow myself to have food that's in the house, then do it. So it's really a boundary with myself and with my family, and good communication.
Awesome. Again, another explosion of emojis there. So a lot of people associate him with yourself there. And finally, another question, which I'm not sure, again, you can give direct advice on, but there is a broader question here, which is, now I'm menopausal and it's making my diabetes much harder to manage. So any advice? And actually, given that there are so many factors that do affect diabetes, and that you could be going through a time with any number of conditions affecting your self-management, do you have any advice generally for sort of scenarios like that?
Yeah, I think that really having good communication, this is really a place where good communication with their healthcare team is really important, because as we know, hormones of all factors, and that's, both, female hormones and menopausal hormones, as well as stress hormones, have an impact on our blood sugars. And we really need to have that kind of personalized care to get the best, the best treatment there. But from a mental health point of view, I think the first thing is recognizing that being menopausal is impacting you, and having that awareness can really be really empowering, because if you didn't know that, but you saw that your blood sugars were having trouble, you would feel lost, and you would feel less capable of taking care of yourself. So having that awareness is key. And then also using that awareness as a way to give yourself some self-compassion, and to say, yeah, I'm having some trouble right now, but I have to be easy on myself and not be so hard on myself, because there are some things that are out of my control. And while that's not very much fun, that's okay. Because you know that if there's something that you could do to fix it, or to solve it, or to make it better, you would. And maybe you can by reaching out to your healthcare team. But if you can't, you have to be compassionate with yourself and say, yeah, this is not a very fun time right now, but I'm doing the best that I can, and I'm going to keep on going.
Cool. Wonderful final answer there, Mark. And again, very appreciated by the chat, it seems. And so let's move on to the prize draw. So as promised, we ran some polls and we offered a £20 Amazon voucher. And so at random, we have Kimberly Haynes. So congratulations, Kimberly. We'll be in contact with you by email to let you know again that you've won, and send you your Amazon voucher. So congratulations to you. But that is kind of all for tonight. So maybe, Mark, do you have any final thoughts on what we've covered today?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a wonderful conversation. And I really want to, remind everybody that diabetes is both a physical condition, but it also is a mental condition. And we have to really pay attention to both of those things. And without that sort of balance, and without that sort of perspective on both sides, we're not going to be able to live our best lives. Our goal, my goal, your goal is to make sure that diabetes is not the forefront of your mind. And we want to do everything that we can to make sure your diabetes is well managed, but also that it is, that you're able to live your life. And that's really the most important thing. And if you're having trouble doing that, then it's a good sign for you that, maybe you need some support, whether that's from a therapist or from some other support system that exists all over the place. And so please reach out to those things and engage in them, because, we want to help you. We want to partner with you. We want to help you. We want to help you to make sure that you're living your best and most free and flexible life, even with diabetes, along for the ride.
Cool. Wonderful. So yeah, thank you so much, Mark, for an incredibly insightful and thoughtful session. So you can follow Mark on Instagram at the Diabetes Psychologist. You can Google the Diabetes Psychologist podcast to catch up on the amazing podcast content available. There's quite a number of podcast recordings available now, which is great. I've been listening to a lot of those. And you can reach him by email at mark@cdmh.org. So yeah, again, can we have some final appreciation for Mark in the chat for sharing his time with us, and who's been amazing whilst doing so. So again, from me, thank you so much for joining us, Mark.
Thank you, Barry. Good to see you guys.
Awesome. And so if you want to find out more about Quinn or share your thoughts on today's sessions, share with @QuinnDiabetes app on Instagram and Twitter. You can go to quintech.io for more details about Quinn and the app. If you are in the UK, Ireland, or the US, you can download Quinn from the Apple App Store now. Search for Quinn Diabetes Management. We design Quinn for you, so if you have any thoughts or ideas on what we can improve, please do let us know. We've worked with over 300 people in designing Quinn so far, and we would love to get that number even higher. Finally, we will be holding another webinar in June where we'll be discussing feeling like a failure because of diabetes management with Dr. Mark Lynch. Again, quite another hard-hitting topic there. But overall, thank you all for watching. Enjoy the rest of your evenings, days, mornings, wherever you are. And please download Quinn. So yeah, thank you and goodbye.